There is a brand new book out from St. Martin's Press that is getting a lot of attention that has at least some connection to St. Louis. The book is called Alex's Wake, A Voyage of Betrayal and Journey of Remembrance. Martin Goldsmith, welcome to Big 550 KTRS here in St. Louis.
With you, McGraw. Thank you.
Now, you were born and raised here in St. Louis for a little bit?
That is correct. I was born in Barnes Hospital way back in 1952. Grew up, of course, a Cardinal fan. I was in Busch Stadium, the old Busch Stadium, on September 29th, 1963, to see Stan Musial's very last game. My mom was a member of the St. Louis Symphony for 21 years, which is why I was born in St. Louis.
All right, so once a St. Louisan, always a St. Louisan, so welcome back.
Great to be back.
You are now a writer, and you've written a book called Alex's Wake, A Voyage of Betrayal and a Journey of Remembrance. The story is almost incomprehensible, but it take us to the outline of Alex's Wake and give us the premise of the book.
Well, exactly 75 years ago today, on May the 13th, 1939, a ship called, coincidentally enough, the St. Louis, left Hamburg, Germany, bound for Havana, Cuba. There were more than 900 Jewish refugees on board that ship. Among the 900, my grandfather, Alex Goldschmidt, and my uncle, Helmut Goldschmidt. The idea was that the two of them would land in Havana, plant the family flag, set up a household, and send for the rest of the family. But when the ship pulled into Havana Harbor, it was discovered that power plays in the Cuban government made it impossible for more than just a handful of those 900 refugees to disembark. The ship then weighed anchor, sailed north to the coast of the United States. It plied the waters off Florida for several days, coming so close to the land that the people on board the St. Louis could very easily see the lights of Miami. The captain of the ship, Gustav Schröder, was asking for permission to land in Miami, but that permission was denied. The ship then sailed north, asked to be allowed to land in Canada. That was also denied. The ship then sailed back to Europe. On the way back, a deal was brokered whereby the Jewish refugees on board the ship could land in either England, France, Belgium, or Holland. My grandfather and uncle disembarked in France, no doubt very pleased at least not to be back in Germany, but then they spent the next 3 years being sent from one French concentration camp to another before being sent to their deaths in Auschwitz in 1942. And then 3 years ago, my wife and I traveled in their footsteps, beginning in the little village in Lower Saxony in Germany, Sachsenhagen, where my grandfather Alex was born in 1879. We then went to Oldenburg, the city where he established his women's clothing store, to Hamburg, from where the St. Louis sailed, then to all of those places in France where they were held, and finally to the Polish city of Auschwitz, or Auschwitz in Germany. And the book, Alex's Wake, is a story of those two journeys, my grandfather's and uncle's journey back in 1939 to 1942, and what my wife and I discovered on the road 3 years ago during our 6 weeks and 5,700 miles on the road.
Alex's Wake is the book. Martin Goldschmidt is our guest. How is it possible, Martin, that a ship of 900 refugees that was turned away from Havana, the United States, and Canada, and headed back for Europe, how has that story been lost to history?
Well, it is one of those stories that certainly has come back to haunt us, as it presaged the indifference the world had for the Jews of Europe as the Holocaust was gathering. There certainly have been some commemorations about the St. Louis. 5 years ago, on the 70th anniversary of the St. Louis's journey, a Senate resolution was passed which, in effect, acknowledged that the United States should have done a lot more to aid those refugees. So some light has been shed on that voyage. I hope my book will shed a bit more light.
Why was the ship called the St. Louis?
Well, I'm not really sure, to be perfectly honest. It was the pride of the Hamburg America line, which regularly had ships going between Hamburg and New York City and Havana and Halifax and Rio de Janeiro and other cities in the Western Hemisphere. It was a luxury liner, and interestingly enough, the passengers on board the St. Louis 75 years ago, they were treated to a first-class experience, and it was probably their first first-class experience in a long time, since these were all Jews who had been very badly treated the previous 6 years since Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Hitler had been arrested the night of Kristallnacht 6 months earlier. That was the case with many of the refugees on board the St. Louis. So I'm sure the journey west between Hamburg and Havana was considered quite enjoyable by most of them.
Let's talk about the 900 refugees that left Germany. Were they asked to leave? Did they escape? How did this 900, and why were there not more, and why was it just these 900?
Well, the capacity of the St. Louis was just about 930 people, and 937 passengers boarded the St. Louis in Hamburg. No, none of these passengers was traveling for pleasure, McGraw. They were all leaving Germany under duress. This was one of the interim solutions to the so-called Jewish problem, which of course would culminate in the final solution, which was announced in 1942 at Wannsee. But here in 1939, this interim solution to the Jewish problem, as the Nazis called it, was to basically kick as many Jews out of the country as possible. So everybody on board the St. Louis was leaving under duress.
Were there other ships like this?
There were, yes. There were refugee ships which had come earlier, which would go later. But because of these particular circumstances, the fact that they were turned away from Cuba, the U.S., and Canada, the St. Louis has become the most infamous of those refugee ships.
So the other refugee ships, wherever they sent, were any of them accepted into the U.S.?
Well, some which had come over, with the proper understanding by the government. I mean, the reason the St. Louis was turned away, ostensibly, was that the U.S. was under the auspices of the Immigration Act of 1924, which stipulated certain quotas for various countries. So the idea was that if these 900 were to land in Miami, for instance, that 900 other potential refugees or immigrants who had filled out the proper paperwork and had done all things correctly by the book would be shoved back further down the line, and it was considered unfair at the time. That was the ostensible reason the St. Louis was turned away.
What was was that a smokescreen, or what was the other story?
Well, there were other reasons as well, which I discovered to my sorrow when I did research for the book. The United States was a fairly anti-Semitic country at the time. I quote several polls taken in 1938 and 1939 by the very well-respected Roper polling organization, which showed that Americans really didn't like Jews, were suspicious of Jews. 53% of those polled thought the Jews were not like everybody else and they should face restrictions in their business lives and their social lives. A full 10% of people responding to a poll in 1939, just as the St. Louis journey was going on, 10% of the respondents thought that Jews should be deported from the United States. So I'm sure President Roosevelt felt that given all of that, he didn't want to get too far out ahead of public opinion at the time.
The book is called Alex's Wake, A Voyage of Betrayal and a Journey of Remembrance by Martin Goldschmidt. Martin, how much of this story did you know growing up, and how much did you learn while researching it?
I knew very little about it. My mother and father managed to escape to this country in 1941 because they were musicians. I mentioned that my mother went on to become a member of the viola section of the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra for 21 years. But by 1941, June of 41, they had managed to make it to New York City. And by that time, my grandfather Alex and Uncle Helmut were in the midst of this 3-year ordeal, which would end with their being sent to Auschwitz. In June of 41, they were in the French camp of Rivesaltes near the Pyrenees in the southwestern part of France. And they began writing letters to their relatives here in America. And when I began work on my first book, called The Inextinguishable Symphony, my father sent me a little pile of letters from his father and his brother, which had come to him in New York from their camps in France. And he grew up he went through the rest of his life with a great deal of guilt for not having been able to save his father and his brother. And I think I inherited some of that guilt, which is one of the reasons I embarked on this journey 3 years ago to follow in my grandfather's and uncle's footsteps. It was a totally irrational desire to save them, since after all they'd been murdered 10 years before I was born. But since my father had failed to save his father and his brother, I thought it was somehow had fallen to me to save my father's father and his brother. And one of the reasons that I went on this 6-week journey of remembrance was this irrational desire to save my relatives.
The book is called Alex's Wake, a Voyage of Betrayal and a Journey of Remembrance, Martin Goldschmidt. It's an unbelievable story. When they were sent back when they were turned away from Cuba and America and Canada and went back, he had a choice to get off and thought France was his safest bet?
Well, I have to confess, McGraw, I'm not exactly sure how that decision was made. Again, France, England, Belgium, and Holland all stepped forward and said, we will accept some of the refugees on board the St. Louis. As I understand it, a passenger could say, well, I have a reason that I want to go to one of these 4 countries, and they would have done their best to agree to that. I'm not quite sure why my grandfather and uncle got off in France. I'm sure at the time they did think, well, at least we're not in Germany. But, of course, by this time it was June 1939, and 3 months later, on September 1st, 1939, the Second World War began, and Alex and Helmut metamorphosed in the eyes of the French from well-meaning refugees to enemy aliens, since my grandfather and uncle still retained their German passports, and Germany and France were now at war. So that's when their troubles began.
So Poland gets invaded in September of 39. That starts the war. Your father, who is German, is looked upon as an enemy in France and is looked upon as a Jew in Germany. So, I mean, he was a man without a country, in a sense.
Exactly. Now, my grandfather and uncle, yes, were initially thought of as enemy aliens, but then a year later, when the German army overran France, the French government surrendered, the new right-wing Vichy government took over in France, it became just about as anti-Semitic as Germany had been. Germany passed the Nuremberg laws in 1935, which essentially stripped the Jews of Germany of their citizenship. The French did the same thing, really, on October 3rd, 1940, when they passed something called the Statut des Juifs, which also was a series of laws against the laws against the Jews of France. Jews could no longer serve as civil servants. They couldn't be doctors or lawyers. They couldn't be radio announcers. They couldn't own pets. If you owned a business, you had to put a little yellow sign in the window of your business, identifying yourself as a Jewish business. So things went really downhill for the Jews of France after that.
It was, the book is called Alex's Wake, A Voyage of Betrayal and a Journey of Remembrance, Martin Goldschmidt. Martin, it wasn't just Jews for Nazi Germany. It was a whole bunch of people, wasn't it?
Absolutely. All of these so-called undesirables, people who were considered not healthy enough, obviously homosexuals, gypsies, many people fell under the rubric of undesirables, and many people were murdered. Where my grandfather and uncle ended up in Auschwitz, about 1.1 to 1.5 million Jews were murdered in Auschwitz, but many tens of thousands of those other undesirables were murdered in Auschwitz as well.
It's an incredible story, one that I can't believe as a history major I never heard and never knew, but it's these ripples of history that happened not necessarily to FDR and to Truman, but happened to your grandfather, my grandfather, and the person walking down the street. That is the real fabric of history.
Exactly right, and what I hope people will take away from the book, both the story of the journey that my grandfather and uncle took under duress back in 1939 to 1942, and the journey that my wife and I took 3 years ago following in their footsteps, is that these things are not in the distant past. I mean, as William Faulkner once said, the past is never dead. It isn't even past. For many of the people I met along the road 3 years ago, the events of 70 years ago are considered current events. I met so many amazing and incredible people who did their best to help us as we tried to uncover the trail of my grandfather and uncle. So it was an amazing journey that I took 3 years ago, and I'm very proud of the book.
Yeah, the book is called Alex's Wake, A Voyage of Betrayal and a Journey of Remembrance, Martin Goldschmidt. Martin, You this go around, you're not stopping through St. Louis, but maybe we'll get you in the fall. We'd love to have you on the show and talk more about it.
I'd love to, McGraw. That would be great. Thank you.
You got it. The book is called Alex's Wake. Martin Goldschmidt. Martin, best of luck with the book, and thanks for telling a unbelievable story.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
You got it. Back in a moment here. Big 550, KTRS St. Louis.